Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Bonavera Institute of Human Rights and to this lecture. My name, for those of you who I have not met, is Kate O'Regan, and I'm the director of the Bonavera Institute. And we are really delighted to be welcoming Professor Harold Hongju Ko to deliver this lecture on human rights under siege in the age of artificial intelligence. As many of you will know, Professor Ko is the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale University, and he's also a former dean of the law school at Yale University. He's had an enormously distinguished career, having been an alum both of Harvard and Oxford, so it's a homecoming for him. But he has also had a distinguished career really between legal practice and scholarship, which is something that the Bonavera Institute seeks to foster, this idea that there are really strong connections between practice and scholarship in the broad fields of international law and human rights. So it's a real delight, Harold, to have you here. Thank you so much. I have warned Harold that we have got relatively sharp stop at 6:15, so I'm sort of warning all of you too. Unfortunately, although there'll be much to talk about, I have little doubt, we are going to hold to a reasonably tight time frame. We'll all be, at least quite a lot of us, I think, will be going over to New College afterwards. But Harold, a warm welcome. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much. Let me start with this video.
Good morning. Before we start, I want to be absolutely clear about one thing. We are here to serve the British people, not the whims of some European imperialist state. We are a proud nation, and no bureaucrat in Brussels can tell us what to do. We are a democracy, not some perverse, genuflecting mouse puppet on a European finger. The idea of that makes me physically sick. They took our sovereignty, our dignity, the very essence of our Britishness. And what has the European Convention of Human Rights ever done for us in return?
Or the right to a fair trial.
What?
The right to a fair trial.
Well, that's true, I suppose.
The right to privacy?
Well, yes, all right. I grant you, fair trials and privacy are two things the European Convention of Human Rights has given us. But...
What about freedom from torture and degrading treatment?
Freedom of religion?
Freedom of expression?
Freedom from discrimination.
Ooh, how about freedom from slavery?
Yes, of course. Freedom from slavery goes without saying. But...
Protecting victims of domestic violence.
Okay. But apart from the right to a fair trial, the right to privacy, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom from discrimination, freedom from slavery, and freedom from torture.
And degrading treatment.
And degrading treatment, and protecting victims of domestic violence. But apart from these, what has the European Convention on Human Rights ever done for us?
Peace in Northern Ireland?
What?
Well, I mean, and the Good Friday Agreement depends on the European Convention of Human Rights. So without it, we'd have to make peace all over again. And what a palaver that would be. No, thank you.
No, look here. I'm not against human rights, of course not. But I say we don't need lectures from the frogs and the crowds.
Quite right.
This is Britain, the land of Magna Carta. We invented human rights, for God's sake. We should be writing our own Bill of Rights and foisting it on the Europeans. Let's see how they'd like it then.
We've already done that, actually.
What?
Well, after we won the war, British legal experts did draft a Bill of Human Rights to help Europe sort itself out, protect people from abuses of state power, that kind of thing.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
You sure?
Oh, yes.
Oh. Well, that's good. What's it called?
the European Convention on Human Rights?
Oh, fuck off!
So it won't surprise you that human rights are under siege here in the UK 9 years after Brexit was voted, despite a documented annual loss of GDP of 40 to 100 billion British pounds a year. There's a growing backlash against human rights. Only 51% favor Remain, with the election perhaps 3 years off. Nigel Farage's party favors withdrawal, which would require repeal of the '98 Human Rights Act, violate the TCU, and break the Good Friday Accords, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. But it's part of human rights being under siege everywhere. Russia ravages Ukraine. Xi Jinping dominates China. It was reported that he's asked for a contingency plan for invading Taiwan by 2027. Netanyahu, as you know, continues his operations in Gaza, Iran, and now to Syria. Human rights institutes for the UN are floundering. European voices are struggling, and the US has turned against human rights. I was head of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the State Department. 80% of the staff has been fired. The rest has been renamed Democracy, Rights, and Religious Freedom. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, called it left-wing activists waging vendettas against anti-woke leaders. They deny the value of criticizing autocracies. They've eliminated the office that deals with the International Criminal Court and imposed sanctions on ICC judges. They've gutted human trafficking, union busting, and forced labor, and they've eliminated the Agency for International Development and the sources of humanitarian assistance. What I want to do today is three things. First, assess the human rights regime, which many of you have been studying this summer. Second, ask how introducing artificial intelligence into the mix can exacerbate the human rights siege as it affects four areas: authoritarianism, climate change, global public health, and what we call the forever war. And then what we can do in the face of this to give you an attitude, a strategy, and some principles, three in particular, which I call reaffirm the truth, promote accountability, and develop legal frameworks for protection. Kate was nice enough to review my background. For 40 years, I've been a professor of international law at Yale. I've been in the government 5 times, most recently in the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights from 2009 to 2013 as the legal advisor of the State Department. And I returned in the first year of the Biden administration as the senior advisor in the legal advisor's office, which is the highest political position, as well as serving as Ukraine's legal counsel before the International Court of Justice and other tribunals for the last 9 years. And let me just start, to all of you who have been taking the human rights course, by just asking you to consider afresh what a simple, radical idea international human rights is. It's amazing. International, held by all against all, human, gained solely by being born as a human being, rights. These are not privileges, they are trump cards. Not to make a pun, they're inalienable, they can't be assigned, they're not conditioned on your literacy, taxation, property ownership, your wealth. And they're not simply claims. The government should not simply protect, but organize themselves to respect these rights. This is a stunning idea, but we hold these truths to be self-evident. Now, this idea is connected philosophically to many theories, which I'm sure you've studied over the course of this term: natural rights, popular sovereignty, social contract theory. But most fundamentally in the Western liberal democratic traditions of the US and the French revolutions, including the US Declaration of Independence, the French Revolution, speaking of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, the United States, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All persons are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In modern Kantian philosophy, it's been expressed in the political philosophy that persons are ends, not means. They have a right to self-fulfillment, and this is carried forward by modern political philosophers like John Rawls and Dworkin. But this is not simply a Western tradition. Other traditions value this as well. So let me just suggest that this idea of international human rights has lived through 5 eras. A prehistory before 1941, what I call the era of universalization, which was in the period before and after World War II, where the focus was on first-generation rights, principally civil and political rights. And then when these norms had been universalized, an era of institutionalization, where institutions were created to respect and enforce these rights. And then the machines started to function in an era of operationalization, which started really in the 70s with the Helsinki Accords and went through the 80s, focusing now more fundamentally on second generation economic, social, and cultural rights. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we entered an era of globalization, where it started to become clear that you should not simply protect pinprick rights, like the right to be free of torture. What you really want to do is to protect healthy systems. My brother's a doctor. He said to me, what's the point of treating lung cancer if the person smokes? It should be about developing a healthy system, namely democracy and good governance. And in the 1989 to 2001 period, there was discussion of a right to good governance, a right to democracy, and then a period of global pessimism, which started after 9/11 and continues to this day. I'll go quickly through these, just so you know. This is, of course, Kenneth Branagh in Henry V, which identifies the laws of war. Ted Moran, who teaches here at Oxford, wrote a brilliant book, Henry's Wars and Shakespeare's Laws, where he identifies the origins of the laws of war, his famous speech, the gentler gamester's the soonest winner. But that body or strand of law merged with state responsibility, humanitarian intervention, international criminal law, the origins of international labor law and the International Labor Organization, and we may talk today more about the right to strike case at the ICJ, and the law of minorities. But it came into fruition as positive law in 1941 with Franklin Roosevelt's 4 Freedoms speech. The 2 most important Americans in this process were Eleanor Roosevelt, whose statue is out there, and Franklin Roosevelt, depicted here, who was, of course, someone who was an extraordinary pioneer for the disabled. A few weeks ago, my wife, Christy, who's here, and I went to Campobello Island, where Franklin Roosevelt woke up at the age of 39 and found that he was totally paralyzed. Now, if you were 39 and totally paralyzed, many of us would give up. Instead, what he did was he went to Warm Springs, Georgia. He started a rehabilitation facility for children with infantile paralysis. He spent nearly all of his money. Toward the end, he learned how to shuffle wearing a brace. And then he went to the Democratic Convention, introduced Al Smith who was the governor of New York, as presidential candidate. It was such a success that he himself became governor of New York and then served 4 terms as president, even though he couldn't walk. Now, in his speech in 1941, he said, here are the 4 freedoms we're fighting to protect. We're not just fighting the Nazis. We're fighting for freedom of speech and religion. In other words, civil and political rights. We're fighting for freedom from want. In other words, economic, social, and cultural rights, and freedom from fear, the Refugee, Genocide, and Torture Convention. So that speech actually was a blueprint for the positive law that was to follow. And then Eleanor, as a member of the UN Human Rights Commission, helped to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you read Marianne Glendon's book, every night she fell to her knees and prayed that, show me a vision of a world made new where these rights are respected. Now, the International Bill of Rights that emerged from that, the UN Charter, which pledges universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, the Universal Declaration, now believed to be customary international law, and the two covenants on civil and political rights and economic and social cultural rights, which entered into force in 1976. But in the same era of universalization, we have the Nuremberg Charter, which introduced the notion of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against the peace, command responsibility, and eliminating the defense of just following orders, the first conventions on humanitarian law, the rise of international adjudication, and then the so-called vertical link between universal human rights and domestic constitutions. By 1956, the paradigm had shifted to prisoners of conscience, people who were particularly protected by Amnesty International, and all of these institutions were suddenly created to protect these norms in all parts of the world. And then in the 1970s and 80s, which, believe it or not, is when I first came to Oxford as a student, the paradigm was ethnic conflict, and the institutions began to operate. And the era of operationalization was where they started to work together in collaborative ways to enforce these norms, with regional systems, national adjudication, the rise of NGOs, all working together in various ad hoc ways. You can think of this as a system of adaptive evolution. How many of you have read Stephen Jay Gould's great essay, The Panda's Thumb? You know, pandas don't have thumbs. The reason is that they're marsupials. They only really do a couple of things. They eat bamboo, they strip bamboo of leaves, and then they eliminate the bamboo. And then they try unsuccessfully to have other pandas. Now, it turns out that they don't have an opposable thumb. They're not primates like we are, but they have developed a vestigial bone, which has sometimes called the panda's thumb, which serves the crude functional purpose of letting you strip leaves from a piece of bamboo. And what I want to suggest is that the UN mechanisms and all these different institutions listed here were a kind of panda's thumb, which allowed this system, this idealistic system of universal norms and institutions to start to function and work together, with the grease and lubricant being non-governmental organizations. Take, for example, the UN. The Secretary General was supposed to be a ministerial figure until the great Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld on the left, probably the greatest Secretary General, Kofi Annan. Our current Secretary General, who has had a rough patch, Antonio Guterres. They developed in 1993 a High Commissioner of Human Rights, who you recognize here, the current one, Volker Turk. You've heard about the International Court of Justice. We have here the former president of the court, my friend Joan Donahue, and the cases they've heard, which increasingly address human rights issues under the Genocide Convention, to which many countries are parties and therefore giving contentious jurisdiction. And then UN World Conferences. So Hillary Clinton, when she was First Lady, and she was here at the Bonavero to dedicate the Eleanor Roosevelt statue, turned the 1995 Beijing Women's Conference, which was a nothing event, into a major platform of action to mainstream gender into UN activities. She just declared women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And then years later, at the Human Rights Council, when she was Secretary of State, a speech that I worked on, LGBTQ rights are human rights, and human rights are LGBTQ rights. The regional human rights systems developed, most of all in Europe, and I know you studied these in your fundamentals class. The European system, the most textured, because there are actually 4 systems. In Strasbourg, the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights. In Brussels, both the EU and NATO playing important human rights functions. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the so-called Helsinki-Warsaw process. And then the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg. National courts, we have, as you've studied in international law, monistic jurisdictions, where international law and domestic law are united, and human rights norms can function as quasi-constitutional norms that are directly enforceable. In jurisdictions where international and domestic are dualized, litigants can assert human rights claims in domestic litigation if they can find a vehicle to do so, as the US did in the great case of Filartiga versus Peña-Irala. Now, just as a sidelight, I know many of you are Americans, the US Supreme Court has waged a rhetorical war against looking to foreign law to guide its understanding of its own constitutional provisions. All of the justices, without regard to political leaning, have absurdly rejected our originalist history. 12 justices have, in fact, said we don't look to foreign law, but then they look to foreign law when it suits their purpose. Most recently, Alito, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch with regard to the Dobbs case. Now, let me just make a simple point. You know, if I go to a taco truck and I say I'd like some kimchi on my taco, the guy running the taco truck doesn't say, you don't put kimchi on the taco. He just puts it on. Why? Because Americans are borrowers. If I go to a bar mitzvah and they start playing Gangnam Style, I don't say turn off the music, because Gangnam Style is a Korean song. In fact, it's been played 10 billion times, mostly by members of my family and myself. So you know what I'd say to our justices? You know, Brett Kavanaugh, my former student, made the absurd statement, I believe in the American rule of law. Well, what about the rule of law, Brett? You know, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, they are not just American concepts. They are as American as Apfelkuchen or der Frankfurter. Now, in the period post the fall of the Berlin Wall was a period of enormous optimism. This is when I served in the Clinton administration and Madeleine Albright's Human Rights Bureau. We saw globalization of freedom across the globe, the revival of international criminal adjudication in the Yugoslav, Rwanda, and ICC, the expansion of regional systems, particularly NATO, to address ethnic conflict, the Vienna Conference, which talked about human rights as universal, indivisible, and interdependent, and a revival of US human rights policy under Clinton and Albright. But then after 9/11, the Bush administration introduced the notion of a global war on terror, sometimes called the GWAT, with a new emphasis on freedom from fear. American exceptionalism became the norm. Challenges were made to international criminal adjudication. There were efforts to find loopholes to the law of war norms to exempt Guantanamo, and we had people like John Bolton expressing hostility to human rights mechanisms. But this was an era in which human rights survived because of its connectivity. Substantive connectivity to other movements, equality, democracy, demilitarization, corporate responsibility, environmental, information and technology, public health, and communicative connectivity, the rise of the internet, which was not imagined before this period. And so we then had, in the first Trump administration, a period of global pessimism. This is a book I wrote in 2018. I mention it because I've just been asked to do a revised and expanded second edition coming out from Oxford Press next fall. I ask you to buy that one as well. And then in the Biden administration, there was a moment of flourishing where Biden said human rights must be at the center of our foreign policy, not the periphery. He pledged the 4 R's to reverse the practices of Trump. He took a number of important actions to end the Muslim ban, restore human rights at home, allow transgender individuals to serve in the military. He created the White House Gender Policy Council, where my daughter worked, and then he lost. And so today we are 6 months into the Trump 2.0 administration, where we don't have a foreign policy anymore. It's a sanctions policy in the name of Homeland Security. I won't go through most of these because most of them have been blocked by injunctions, almost 65 to date. You see a huge range of immigration measures, attacks on the media, law firms, universities, law schools, yo-yo tariffs, preemptive bombing of Iran's facilities, committing US military into LA city streets and the like. And all of this is in the face of 21st century human rights challenges that will outlive Trump. Drones, clones, women's rights, trans rights, mass migration, cyber and AI. So, where are we at? You know all this, but I thought it was a helpful review to you at the end of your course. It's everything everywhere all at once. We have a system of overlapping under-enforcement, where all these different kinds of organizations are trying to serve the same goal. If you were to assess this system, what's miraculous is that it exists. It's a glass half full. It's not the human rights system you design. It reflects wild redundancy, but each issue has its own monitoring mechanism. Some have many. And so we have 2 kinds of enforcement that are going on. First, horizontal enforcement from country to country, from intergovernmental organization to nation state, and increasing opportunities for what I call transnational legal process, or the vertical enforcement of human rights by the incorporation of these international norms into domestic law, for example, through the UK Human Rights Act. And there are 2 ways to look at the video that you just saw. On the one hand, the move to oust the European Convention from Human Rights from the British system continues. On the other hand, Brexit was voted 9 years ago, and they haven't done it yet. Now, all of this was founded on a notion of Kantian global governance expressed in Immanuel Kant's Toward Perpetual Peace, where he said, the law of nations shall be founded on free states sharing democratic values. Now, some would caricature this as world government, but what he's really talking about is a league of nations, a community of democracies in which countries work together to try to address shared problems through shared values. Now, authoritarians everywhere, and my friend Sally Hope will remember her classmate from Jesus College, Bong Bong Marcos, in the middle of the top frame. They all have the same global vision. They attack courts, they reject diversity, they demonize immigrants, they cow legislators, they disparage bureaucrats, they attack the media, they reward their cronies, and they say that constitutional checks and balances must give way to the will of the people. These authoritarians would offer instead Orwell's 1984 vision of authoritarian spheres of influence, which it's worth reading again if you haven't done so recently because it's so prescient. A world in which there is no truth, truth is constantly being redefined, there's no accountability, there's no protection for human rights, and there's no democracy in your governance. So that is the system that we have. And into this mix, we introduce artificial intelligence. When Jimmy Carter died, this picture was shown. This is what it was like in 1980. Can you believe this? When we were students at Oxford, Sally and I, we didn't have computers. We had we barely had typewriters. We sent notes to each other by sending little pigeon post notes through the porter's lodge. And something like this, a green screen, was considered a stunning development. Now, how will AI affect human rights? Simply put, if left unregulated, it will exacerbate other sources of human rights stress in these 4 areas, and in particular through these different means. So we need an attitude, a strategy, and some principles. Let me inform you that I've now reached the low moment of the lecture. It's uphill from here. So what's the attitude? Our convener, the great Justice Cato Regan, had much time with Nelson Mandela. I had 30 seconds. He was president of South Africa, and he came to the United Nations to speak at the UN Security Council, and he walked in, and we were all stunned, and Richard Holbrooke, our ambassador, says, "Mr. President, you were imprisoned on Robben Island for 26 years. How did you survive?" And Mandela puts on a big smile, looking just like this, and he goes, "You know, I missed that time. I got a lot of reading done." In that second, we all understood how he survived. He did not get discouraged. Now here in England, or in the United States, Scottish people have a term they use, ahone, poor us. Like, we are so screwed. We're so miserable. Let's just give up. Trump is president. You just gave me a litany of reasons to be depressed. So I'm depressed. And that justifies me lying in my bed or watching TikTok, people dancing or whatever. We need a different attitude, which is, this is one of the times we have the most tools available to fight for human rights. Now, along with Mandela, I would mention The Martian. I don't know, how many of you, raise your hand if you saw it. Yeah, I don't want to give away a spoiler, but an astronaut is caught on Mars. And at the end of the movie, they ask him, "Did you think you were finished?" And he said, "Every day." He said, "But what I did instead was I said, let me solve this problem, and then I'll solve the next problem, and I'll solve the next problem, and I'll solve the next problem. And if I solve enough problems, I get to go home." Well, that should be our strategy. Solve enough problems, and we get to live out or live through this period of discouragement. Now, what are the principles? When I left the State Department Human Rights Bureau, I was asked to give a speech called "A U.S. Human Rights Policy for the 21st Century." And I said that there were 2 basic ideas that should be at the core of any human rights policy. First, tell the truth. Tell the truth. If other people want to tell lies, say, I'm not going to do it. But we believe in the truth. And then take a consistent position toward the past, present, and future. Toward the past, pursue accountability, but also, when appropriate, reconciliation. Toward the present, to speak out and act against ongoing abuses, not stay silent. And for the future, build democracy. Attack root causes and prevent atrocities before they occur. And the thesis of this lecture is that these principles, 25 years later, still apply. With regard to AI, we should value the truth and reaffirm it through fact-checking science, multiple authoritative voices. We should set legal and normative standards. We should create accountability mechanisms toward the past and preventive techniques to the future. So we shift from post hoc reaction to anticipatory architectural frameworks. So let me give you some examples. By the way, is Dara Murray here? Where is he? How are you doing? Well, I thought before I gave this lecture, maybe I ought to check and see if you have anything on this. I noticed he's teaching a course called Human Rights and AI. Oh. But he says something, Derek, you pronounce it Derek? Dara. AI can produce complex, multifaceted, and reverberative harms, principally by distorting the truth and spreading misinformation. This aids authoritarian repression, undermines the effective functioning of democratic societies, in many of their functions and negatively impacts the individual's ability to develop their personhood. Let's take covert racial profiling. The High Commissioner for Human Rights has said the bias from the past leads to bias in the future. So AI decision makers can drive practices in which racial discrimination is embedded into future practices. For example, if programmers target particular facial racial features for, say, military actions, we could have AI-assisted ethnic cleansing. Or how about voice recognition? How did the Israelis kill so many Hamas militants? They used voice recognition to get clips of their voices, and then they targeted them through the GPS on their phones. Large language models like ChatGPT and Gemini hold racist stereotypes about speakers of African American vernacular English spoken by Black Americans. So it's clear that AI can reinforce racial profiling in surveillance. How many of you have seen this movie by the guy who made Succession, Mountainhead? Any of you? Yeah, you know, it's about these tech bros in this spectacular home, and one of them has developed a software which can be replicated to make people think that hate speech is being unleashed. Well, one such tech bro is Elon Musk. He's created something called Grok 4. It outperforms most graduate students, but it also generated anti-Semitic content when generated on a chat bot for X. The company removed the post, says it's since taken steps to block hate speech, but it can happen again. Does anybody here trust Elon Musk to do this right? I don't think so. Or how about the next Supreme Court test, Doe versus Cisco Systems? As you know, in China, the Falun Gong are an exercise group that became a philosophy of wellness. The People's Republic of China decided to persecute them, and in doing so, they built the so-called Great Firewall of China with the help of Cisco Systems. And so now Falun Gong torture survivors have sued Cisco under the Alien Tort Statute for facilitating government persecution of the Falun Gong. The US Ninth Circuit has held that aiding and abetting liability can establish liability under the Alien Tort Statute, which of course means that if the case were to get past discovery and get into trial, you could have liability on the part of Cisco. Now, this case was decided by the Ninth Circuit. They rejected rehearing en banc. It's gone to the Solicitor General's office because of a reference from the Supreme Court call for the views of the SG. By September 30th, we could have a cert grant recommended by the Trump administration. You think the Trump administration is going to go against Cisco Systems? And it could be the first opportunity for the Supreme Court to consider this issue. How about deep fakes and cybersecurity? The fact of the matter is that most authentication methods, like usernames, passwords, one-time codes, authenticator apps, don't prevent tricking a person to hand over their credentials. If someone calls me up and persuades me that they're my wife, and she says, "What's your password?" and I give it to you, then it doesn't matter what kind of 2, 3, 4, or 5-factor authentication I have. It turns out with just 15 seconds of someone's speech uploaded to one of the Speechify apps, you can type out any message and have it read aloud in their voice, like the voice of Marco Rubio. And so, a few weeks ago, an audio deepfake impersonating Rubio contacted a whole series of high officials asking them for sensitive information and to gain account access. Now, they weren't fooled, but next time they might be. So how do we address this? Back in 2020 during the pandemic, a number of us, and I want to call out Dr. Svetlana Van Bentham, my college, and her mother, hi, Mom, how are you? Who is a fellow of the, research fellow of the ELAC at the Blavatnik School, and working with Dapo Akande, who is the Chichele professor, we developed something called the Oxford Process on International Law Protections in Cyberspace, along with Duncan Hollis, a colleague of ours who teaches at Temple. And our view, and you should go check out the website, was that you could codify international law rules of cyberspace by articulating consensus behavior that governs state behavior. And so over the time of the pandemic, we developed 5 Oxford statements, each signed by over 100 prominent international lawyers that focused on areas of broad agreement, what we called no-fly zones, which are always protected, like healthcare, vaccine, elections, critical infrastructure, and things that are always forbidden, like per se illegal activity. You know, why should we allow ransomware ever? So the Oxford Statement 4 discusses the exact issue of information operations. It makes clear that not all speech is permitted at all times, that online hate speech, disinformation, misinformation can be banned, especially if they cause physical or non-physical effects to individuals, particularly incitement to hostility or violence. What about electoral interference? Just yesterday, can you believe this? The President of the United States reposted an AI-generated video showing former President Obama sitting in a jail cell after being arrested by FBI agents. This kind of thing obviously was done for trolling, but you can imagine this being done to influence elections in various countries by trashing the reputation of various candidates in close elections. The Times found that these deepfakes have transformed elections in at least 50 countries, and this is the new frontier for influence operations. Well, it turned out that we thought about this too. We have an Oxford Statement against foreign electoral interference, which prohibits cyber operations by states that have adverse consequences for other states' electoral processes, electing, selecting individuals for public office, as well as referenda, plebiscites, etc. Now, each of these areas requires more regime building, and I'm happy to talk about it. How do you move from knowledge to networks, to norm development, to law declaring forums, to internalization into domestic law, which is what I call the transnational legal process. But let's take an example. We all know about the threats of climate change. Did you know that AI vastly increases the carbon footprint because it's so energy intensive? AI training models can produce carbon dioxide equivalent to 300 round trips from New York to San Francisco. That's the bar on the right, 5 times the lifetime of an average car. In AI, garbage in produces garbage out. And we have e-waste disposal produced by AI technology that produces hazardous chemicals. Driverless cars and delivery drones can lead to overconsumption and increasing waste. You know, normally you would wait and then go to the store and then buy 10 things. But if you're impatient, you could have 10 drones come to your house in a way that overuses pesticides, fertilizer, contaminates soil and water, and harms biodiversity. And then biased environmental management decisions, if presented with inaccurate data, can choose to value economic growth over environmental sustainability. Emmanuel Macron likes to say about the Paris Climate Agreement, there is no planet B. Well, you know, the signatories to the 2015 Paris Agreement entered it into force in November 4th, 2016, and very cleverly set it so no one could withdraw until the day after the next presidential election. Donald Trump tried to do that, and then he was defeated. But nevertheless, he left preemptively, and many other entities stepped in to fill the void. That's transnational legal process in action. My point is that this could work again, but this time we need greater focus in the Paris climate discussions on the environmental impacts of AI. Or just talk about public health. global public health protection turns on telling the truth based on fully shared information, including information shared by the World Health Organization and local authorities. AI acts as a megaphone which can facilitate dissemination of either correct or false information, confusing us about vaccines. And in appointing, ludicrously, Robert Kennedy Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary, and the appalling decision to confirm him for a position for which he's manifestly unqualified, the Trump administration has led an effort to destroy preparedness by putting a megaphone to his misinformation and disinformation. But again, the Oxford process addressed this with regard to cyber operations targeting the healthcare sector and with regard to safeguarding vaccine research. There is no reason why someone should be able to use cyber intrusions to invade the work in building a critically important vaccine. This leads me to the last topic, which is war, particularly drone cyber conflict and so-called private security contractors or private security offensive actors, and the difficulty of ending the forever war, which is the subject of a book being edited by, in which I have a chapter, edited by Brianna Rosen, who's here at the Blavatnik School. Consider this, the US has been at war for 25 years. That's all of this century, 14 years longer than the Revolutionary War, 18 years longer than the Civil War or World War II, and before almost all of you were born, which is why we have so many veterans now in law school. War was meant to be aberrational, but it's become a permanent feature of our international landscape, including in Kashmir, India, Pakistan, Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, North and South Korea. And technology now allows war to be waged remotely and continuously with manageable domestic consequences. If that's so, if war becomes the cheap option, when will we ever get to peace? Now, this is a subject of great concern to me. When I left as legal advisor, I came here to the Oxford Union in 2013 and gave a speech called How to End the Forever War. I suggested some concrete steps that could be taken. Many of them have in fact been taken. And I've written them up in a book that was published last year, The National Security Constitution in the 21st Century. In the Obama-Biden administration, we tried to narrow the international law and domestic law relied on. We tried to integrate targeting and detention into lawful strategies that were set forth in policy guidance. And we clarified that drones are just part of a toolkit, but not the strategy, which is a strategy of diplomatic engagement and leverage. And we tried to declare war rules that would make clear that preemptive war was illegal, which makes Trump's decision to kill Soleimani in 2020 and to drop bunker busters in Iranian facilities in Fordo in violation of these rules. But how do we do this now and control the role of AI? In my time as legal advisor, we decided that we would set forth 10 rules of cyber conflict to operate in cyberspace. Jeremy Hunt, your foreign secretary, repeated those rules in Glasgow. And we started to regulate cyber conflict by both governmental standard setting exercises, but also non-governmental exercises like the Tallinn Manual, and addressing the Oxford process and other kinds of cyber law venues. Which brings us to the invasion of Ukraine, now only 3 years ago. Two things that you may have missed. First, the day before the kinetic invasion, there was a cyber attack that didn't win. The Russians coordinated 48 cyber attacks by compromising computers and spreading wiper malware, positioning disinformation. But the Ukrainians, supported by Microsoft and others, relied on detection, defense, disruption, and deterrence to spread digital assets and data data assets throughout the European cloud and used AI to detect breaches, install corrective patches, and endpoint protection. The next day, Russia started its kinetic war. But it turned out that they were a 20th century Goliath attacking a 21st century David, because sanctions and high-tech military aid forced Putin to change how he wanted to fight the war. He was under sanctions, so he couldn't replenish with modern weapons. So increasingly, he relied on obsolete war material, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, conscripts, and North Korean imports. Meanwhile, Ukraine stayed agile, flexible, and high-tech, and began mass production of drones. Air, sea, and land drones, 3 million of them being produced a year. So now 80% of Russia's 1 million casualties, including the shoot-down of its warplanes, were done by drones, as well as deepfakes, AI surveillance, and loitering munitions. Now, some of the tactics used by the Russians, particularly ransomware, were addressed by the Oxford process, and we will be moving on to the other AI issues in meetings that we're holding this fall and next January. But Putin said, whoever rules AI will rule the world. Take this very seriously, because if he says that, he wants to rule AI. Everybody knows that artificial intelligence is the third great revolution in warfare, and killer robots have already been developed by any number of countries. And here are some propositions: that AI threatens the laws of war, it threatens accountability. We need to make algorithms accountable. This requires regulation, particularly a flat ban treaty requiring humans in the loop, which won't settle all ethical issues, but is crucial. And where are we going? Video game wars. Cyber-assisted AI fighting cyber-assisted AI, with the kinetic work being done by expendable mercenaries with remote command and control. The New Yorker reports that a drone will soon cost $3. And so you can fight these wars with low cost to the perpetrator, high cost to civilians, which will mean more and more fights between robots and civilians. If war is the cheapest option, war will become perpetual. So how do we regulate each piece? I can go through these more. There have been extensive efforts per private security contractors, namely a non-binding statement of principles called the Montreux Document, an international code of conduct that governs companies, and efforts to embed these norms into private contracts to regulate companies like Blackwater. The technology is pretty simple, done by warriors of the keyboard. The machine draws conclusions based on information, it applies the algorithm, and then becomes independently capable of targeting and prescribing lethal force, and it can be done with commercially available software. So let me make clear, the concern is not about autonomous movement, navigation or driving weapons to particular places. It's about the offensive selection of targets with lethal force. And make clear this, AI threatens Nuremberg. Why? Because before Nuremberg, nobody was accountable. Commanders would say, I didn't know what was going on. Street-level officials committing genocide would say, I'm just following orders. Nuremberg made clear that everybody was responsible. But lethal autonomous weapons system could restore the culture of what we call, it wasn't me. You know the song. Because if you can't disentangle how much responsibility is with the hardware or the software designers or the programmers or the builders or the military commanders, the on-site operators or the remote operators, no one will ever be held accountable, and we've returned to the pre-Nuremberg period. Now, some programmers absurdly say AI is perfect. I just say, have you used autocorrect recently? How do you make algorithms accountable? The problem is not the presence of technology. It will always be present. It is the exclusion of human beings, which suggests we should outlaw autonomous robots with no humans in the loop. And we have what we call the Waymo problem. Have many of you ridden in a self-driving car? Well, I did with my son. It moves very slowly and cautiously. But when we went to the airport, He said, you notice there are no Waymos here. And I said, why is that? And he said, because to get to the curb in the airport, they have to be very aggressive or they'll never get in. That means that if you're going to program autonomous weapons, you have to make them super aggressive or they'll be destroyed, which means there's incentive for both sides, all sides, to program autonomous weapons that violate the laws of war. And then they become autonomous killing machines. Now, how do you control through law and technology? Ancient bodies of law can apply, as well as human rights law and criminal law. I suggest that the law for laws should be a last clear chance principle. You need a human operator in the loop. If a human being dies, the known human being with the last clear chance to prevent the tragedy should be held accountable. We should also program these machines with the kinds of rules that regulated the use of drones, follow the Montreux model, have an executive order reinforced by statute, and update policies to ensure producer liability for violations. And in a positive development at the end of the Biden administration, 60 nations endorsed a political declaration that sets forth 4 steps requiring human beings in the loop. Now, there are ethical issues. On the positive side, AI can be superior to human thinking. You know, deep mind can defeat stockfish, which derives from human intelligence in chess. Machines don't get tired. They don't commit errors of humankind, and they're not bored or stressed out. They don't have a self-preservation instinct, so they can enter and traverse radioactive spaces. They can make complex decisions extremely quickly. But look at the cons, the ethical issues. 2 passengers, if you have the choice, who do you save? The 2 passengers in the car or the 5 pedestrians outside the car? That's a trolley problem, the philosopher's trolley problem. You know, Waymo programs it to protect the people in the car. Why? Because otherwise no one would ride in a Waymo. So should programmers favor humans over animals, animals over criminals, the younger over the older, healthy over the unhealthy, professionals over the homeless? AI versus AI war may be cheaper, but who will play God? And here's the irony. There's an could we imagine a robot who's less humane in Ukraine than Putin? Law has its limits, but law is still the necessary first step. You see, I'm a movie fan. In The Avengers, ironically, a piece of artificial intelligence, the Vision says, we don't trade lives. That's false. In fact, we trade lives all the time. If you saw Dunkirk and Oppenheimer, human leaders decide all the time, this group of people's lives will be more important than that. American lives were more important to Harry Truman than Japanese civilians. So these choices will be made, trading lives, but as horrible as they may be, we want them to be made by human beings who face political accountability. So in conclusion, don't worry, Kate, the rise of AI shouldn't change our attitude, strategies, or principles. And here's just a very simple point. We do hold these truths to be self-evident. We believe in international human rights, this simple, radical idea. And let me close with this story. When I was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, NATO engaged in an extensive bombing campaign to liberate Kosovo, which has since become an independent nation. And all of these people were in refugee camps. And I flew to Kosovo. And there were all these refugees, including these 3 guys. And they were Albanian, American, and Serbian judges, all in Kosovo. And they said to me, you're the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. We'd like you to swear them in as judges for the new state of Kosovo. And I said, okay, what do we swear them under? We don't swear them under the Bible because they're not Christians. We don't swear them under the Koran because they're not all Muslims. We don't swear them under Serbian law because Kosovo has just broken away from Serbia. And I said to these three guys, what do you want to do? What oath should you swear? And what law should you apply? And they conferred, and they said, we'd like to take the oath on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. And one of the judges said something I never forget. He said, in this troubled world, this is the only faith we share, namely our shared faith in human rights. So, don't get discouraged. AI is a problem. We will use what we know, the attitude, the strategy, and the principles to get through this next era as well. Thank you.